The chilling pronouncement echoed in Serafina's small Chicago apartment, a sound far colder than the bleak February wind rattling against the windows. Christian Carter, her unemployed husband of 4 years, stood before her, a triumphant, almost grotesque smirk etched across his face, the scent of expensive champagne bought by her clinging to him like a second skin. He had just inherited a staggering $210 million, a fortune plucked from the freshly dug grave of his father Charles, and now, with the casual cruelty of a man discarding a worn-out tool, he tossed their apartment key onto the kitchen table. "You're useless now," he'd sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I don't need you anymore. I finally don't need your pathetic salary anymore, Serafina. $210 million, that's what Dad left me. You've been useful for paying rent, but now..." He punctuated his dismissal with a theatrical shrug of indifference, leaving her to grapple with the shattering weight of his words. "You're worthless to me." It had been a mere 36 hours since they'd buried Charles, Christian's father, a man whose final, whispered words to Serafina about justice arriving in the most unexpected of ways now resonated with an unsettling prescience. As Christian strutted through their shared home, already mentally furnishing a lavish millionaire's existence, Serafina's fingers instinctively closed around the business card tucked in her pocket. The card belonging to Daniel Morrison, Charles's lawyer, and a silent harbinger of an urgent voicemail she hadn't yet addressed. "Mrs. Carter, you need to attend the will reading," the message had begun, its gravitas hinting at untold secrets. "There's a contingency clause your husband doesn't know about." The knowledge of this unseen clause, a silent ticking clock against Christian's smug victory, was a private shield against the sting of his contempt. He'd pulled a bottle of champagne from their refrigerator, a relic of an anniversary he'd long forgotten, and the sharp pop of the cork felt less like celebration and more like a gunshot, slicing through the tense silence of their modest Chicago apartment. He didn't offer her a glass, instead tilting the bottle to his lips, gulping directly from it as his thumb scrolled carelessly through Miami real estate listings on his phone. "I'm thinking South Beach," he mumbled, his eyes never meeting hers, already lost in a fantasy of luxury. "Maybe a penthouse, something with a private elevator. You can keep this place. Consider it severance for your services." Services. 4 years of their marriage compressed into a transactional afterthought, reduced to a mere business arrangement devoid of love, respect, or shared dreams. 4 years. 4 years of Serafina rising before dawn, meticulously preparing for her demanding financial analyst job downtown, while Christian luxuriated in bed until noon, his days filled with nothing but grand, unexecuted schemes. 4 years of watching her carefully accumulated savings steadily erode, poured into the bottomless pit of his failed ventures. The food truck that never secured its permits, the revolutionary app that never launched, the consulting firm that somehow never landed a single client. Each failure chipped away at her hope, leaving behind a deepening chasm of resentment and weariness. She cast her mind back to their first meeting 3 years prior at a bustling networking event at the opulent Drake Hotel. The ballroom had buzzed with Chicago's ambitious hopefuls, each armed with practiced elevator pitches and an overflowing stack of business cards. Serafina had attended reluctantly, pushed by her boss for visibility, finding solace by the bar with a glass of forgettable Chardonnay. Then Christian had materialized beside her, his charm instantly engaging. "You look like someone who actually has a real job," he'd said, flashing a smile that, in hindsight, was too practiced, too perfect, a carefully honed weapon of persuasion. "I'm Christian Carter, currently between ventures, but by choice. I'm taking care of my father. He's not well." The narrative he wove that night was a masterpiece of manufactured sympathy. A young mother lost too soon, an ailing father, and his own promising career nobly sacrificed for family. In a room overflowing with boasts of portfolios and profit margins, his tale of filial devotion had glowed with an almost saintly aura, captivating Serafina. He'd remembered her name hours later in a crowd of 50, brought her a fresh drink without being asked, and even perfectly quoted a nuanced observation she'd made about market volatility. She had been utterly convinced she had found someone who truly listened, someone who paid attention beyond the superficial. My dad built half the shopping complexes on the south side, he'd confided over coffee the next morning, his voice laced with feigned humility. But I learned early that money isn't everything. When someone needs you, you show up. At 35, Serafina was 2 years past a divorce that hadn't ended with a bang, but with the slow, silent deflation of a balloon, leaving both parties hollowed and empty. Her previous marriage had been 2 parallel lines that never fought but never touched, a gradual drifting apart. Christian's vibrant energy, his infectious confidence, his uncanny ability to make even unemployment sound like a strategic career move, had painted vibrant colors back into her once gray, predictable existence. Now, watching him plan his opulent escape with his father's money, another memory surfaced, the first time she'd met Charles. 6 months into their relationship, Christian had finally extended an invitation to dinner. Charles's apartment in Lincoln Park was not the opulent display of family wealth Christian had so often described. It was comfortable, understated, brimming with well-loved books instead of ostentatious status symbols, radiating wisdom rather than flash. Charles, then 78, possessed a mind as sharp as someone half his age. Within minutes of meeting, he was asking Serafina profound, genuine questions about her work, far beyond the polite pleasantries she usually encountered. A financial analyst, he'd mused, adjusting his reading glasses. Tell me, what's your take on the current yield curve inversion? They had conversed for 2 engrossing hours about market dynamics, while Christian sat between them, visibly bored, checking his phone, occasionally interjecting meaningless buzzwords about disruption that had no relevance to their deep discussion. At one point, as Christian retreated to refill drinks, Charles had leaned conspiratorially toward Serafina. "My son needs an anchor," he'd said quietly, his gaze piercing. "Someone who understands that wealth without wisdom is just expensive foolishness. I hope you're that person, but more importantly, I hope you protect yourself too." The warning had been unmistakably there, lovingly veiled in fatherly concern. But Serafina, then, had chosen to hear only the hope. A year later, Charles had quietly but firmly insisted on paying for their small wedding, overriding Christian's protests. Christian had envisioned a lavish reception, packed with what he optimistically called potential investors, people from whom he'd amassed business cards, hoping to impress them with an extravagant display. Charles, however, had gently but resolutely vetoed the idea. 20 guests, simple flowers, a modest reception, he'd decreed. Marriage isn't a networking event. Christian had pouted for weeks, but Charles's will had prevailed. During the ceremony, as Christian delivered a toast that sounded more like a business pitch than a declaration of love, Charles had discreetly slipped Serafina an envelope. Inside lay a check for $5,000 and a poignant note. "For the emergencies I suspect will come. Remember, wisdom matters more than wealth." Her mother, who had flown in from Cleveland, had observed the entire affair with an almost palpable worry. "Are you sure about this?" she'd whispered during the reception. Serafina had been sure then. She had been wrong. "You still standing there?" Christian's grating voice ripped through her reverie. He had drained half the champagne bottle and was now ruthlessly culling suits from their closet, casting aside those he deemed unworthy of his new millionaire persona. "Daniel Morrison says the estate clears final probate tomorrow. I'll have the divorce papers ready by then." Daniel Morrison. The very same Daniel Morrison, Charles's lawyer, whose business card felt like a burning ember in her pocket. The same Daniel Morrison who had left her that urgent voicemail mere hours after the funeral. "Mrs. Carter, it's imperative you attend the will reading. There are aspects of Charles's estate that require your presence. Please call me back immediately." Christian, of course, hadn't breathed a word about any will reading. According to his self-serving narrative, everything was straightforward, settled, his inheritance unequivocally guaranteed. But Charles had been many things. Generous, wise, endlessly patient with his disappointing son, but never, ever straightforward about matters of true importance. "I'm going to stay at the Ritz tonight," Christian announced, casually zipping up a suitcase Serafina had bought him 2 Christmases ago. "Can't stand another night in this dump." This dump? The apartment she'd meticulously paid rent on for 4 years. The sanctuary where Charles had visited every Sunday until his illness rendered him too frail, always arriving with groceries he'd cunningly claimed were extras, always discreetly slipping money into her purse when Christian's attention wandered, always lingering for coffee and genuine conversation after his son inevitably vanished, ostensibly to network at a nearby sports bar. As Christian headed for the door, pulling his suitcase behind him, he paused, a final, self-satisfied flourish. "Oh, and Serafina, don't try to contest anything. Dad told me years ago I was his sole beneficiary, $210 million. It's all mine." The door slammed shut with a resounding thud, leaving Serafina alone in an apartment that suddenly felt vast, empty, yet paradoxically less suffocating. She retrieved Daniel Morrison's card and her phone. Whatever Charles had meticulously planned, whatever justice he had whispered about with his dying breath, she was about to unearth. The phone rang once before Daniel answered, as if he had been patiently waiting. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice imbued with an unspoken gravity, "we need to talk about Charles's will. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? And please come alone. Don't mention this to Christian." Serafina slowly lowered the phone, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly. The apartment, now devoid of Christian's suffocating presence, felt lighter, as if a long-held pressure valve had finally released. She walked to their bedroom closet, where he had left a heap of his discarded clothes, and began the mundane task of hanging them back up, needing the mechanical action to ground her racing mind. 6 months into their marriage, she had performed this exact ritual, tidying up after one of Christian's dramatic exits. That time it had been about his ill-fated food truck venture, the one he'd grandly proclaimed would revolutionize Chicago's lunch scene. He had spent weeks immersed in crafting elaborate spreadsheets, designing logos, and creating social media accounts for a business that existed solely in his vivid, self-serving imagination. The Excel files were works of art, a dazzling display of color-coded projections promising profits that would miraculously triple within the first year. He had even hired a graphic designer to create glossy promotional materials for routes he would never drive, serving food he would never learn to cook. The permits alone had cost $3,000. The commercial kitchen equipment rental, another $5,000. The brightly wrapped vehicle meant to serve as his mobile restaurant, an additional $8,000, now sat abandoned in a storage facility on the south side, silently gathering dust. All of it had been meticulously paid for with Serafina's savings, withdrawn in small, insidious increments, each one justified as an investment in their future. The morning he had finally admitted that the permits had expired and gone unused, he had, with typical audacity, attempted to blame the city of Chicago. "The bureaucracy in this city is designed to kill innovation," he'd ranted, pacing their living room, while Serafina stared blankly at the final notice from the storage facility. "They don't want independent entrepreneurs succeeding. They want us all to be corporate drones." When she had gently, yet firmly, pointed out that thousands of food trucks operated successfully within Chicago, suggesting that perhaps the real issue was his complete lack of food service experience or any business plan beyond fantastical spreadsheets, he had looked at her with genuine wounded hurt. "I thought you believed in me," he'd whispered, and somehow, inexplicably, Serafina had found herself apologizing, comforting him over a failure that had cost her $16,000. That was the very weekend Charles had begun his Sunday visits. He had appeared at their door with 2 overflowing bags of groceries, claiming he had simply bought too much for one person. Christian, already absorbed in researching his next venture, something about a revolutionary app to disrupt the grocery delivery market, had barely looked up from his laptop. "Let me help you put these away," Charles had said warmly, and as they unpacked fresh vegetables, milk, and bread that Serafina hadn't asked for but desperately needed, he had subtly slipped an envelope into her purse. Later, she would find $500 cash inside, accompanied by a small note, "For groceries. Don't mention it." Those Sunday visits quickly evolved into the comforting rhythm that anchored Serafina's sanity. Charles would arrive promptly at 10 a.m., always bearing food, always armed with a plausible excuse about an abundance of produce or an incredible sale. Christian would tolerate his father's presence for perhaps 30 minutes before grandly announcing he had to meet potential investors. A thinly veiled euphemism for watching sports at McGill's bar 3 blocks away. Once Christian departed, Charles would meticulously prepare coffee. Real coffee, not the instant variety Serafina had resorted to for budget reasons. They would sit at their small kitchen table conversing about everything except his son's perpetual failures. He taught her about dividend investing, the quiet power of compound interest, and intricate financial strategies she already understood from her profession, but which took on profound new meaning when discussed with a man who had actually built wealth rather than merely analyzed it. "You have a gift for understanding money," he had told her once, his eyes holding a hint of sadness. Christian never inherited that gift, I'm afraid. It was during one of those Sunday conversations, approximately a year into their marriage, that Serafina had stumbled upon the damning credit card statements. She had been searching for a pen in Christian's expensive leather briefcase, the one he carried everywhere despite having no actual business to conduct, when the folded papers had tumbled out. 3 months of statements for a credit card she hadn't even known existed, detailing charges that twisted her stomach into knots. Levo nightclub, $1,1200. RPM Steakhouse, $800 for a business dinner on a Tuesday he had claimed to be at a startup meetup. Custom suits from a Michigan Avenue boutique, tailored shirts, shoes costing more than their monthly grocery budget. All meticulously labeled as business expenses in his careful handwriting along the margins, as if the mere act of writing the words made them true. She had confronted him that night, the statements spread across their bed like irrefutable evidence in a trial. He had reviewed them with the detached air of someone scrutinizing someone else's minor problems. "You don't understand how business works," he had said, smoothing the collar of one of his new, now recognizable shirts. "These aren't expenses, they're investments. The people I'm meeting, the connections I'm making, they expect a certain presentation. You think Mark Zuckerberg wore a cheap suit when he was raising capital? Mark Zuckerberg famously wears the same gray t-shirt every day." Serafina had shot back, and for a fleeting moment his composure had cracked. "That's because he's already made it. I'm still climbing. And if you can't support that climb, if you can't believe in the vision, then maybe you're the problem." The ensuing argument was the worst they had ever endured, their voices rising to such a pitch that their neighbor had pounded on the shared wall. Christian had stormed out, and Serafina, seeking refuge, had locked herself in the bathroom, sitting on the cold tile floor, crying quietly enough that he wouldn't hear if he returned. Through the thin door, she could hear the distinct sounds of a video game starting up in the living room, the cacophony of gunfire and explosions filling the profound silence that had settled between them. The next morning, Charles arrived for his usual Sunday visit to find Serafina red-eyed and exhausted. Christian, as expected, had already departed for his networking. Charles took one look at her and pulled her into a warm, encompassing hug that smelled of aftershave and an unexpected sense of safety. "How much?" he'd asked quietly, his voice laced with understanding. "I don't know," Serafina had confessed, the words catching in her throat. "Maybe $20,000 total, maybe more." Without hesitation, he had written her a check for $5,000 on the spot, insisting it was an early birthday gift, even though her birthday was 4 months away. Then he had sat down heavily, looking every one of his 79 years. His mother left when he was 15, Charles had said, his gaze fixed on his coffee cup, said she couldn't take the lying anymore. Not big lies, just constant small ones. Where he'd been, what he'd spent, who he'd talked to. Stories that didn't need to be stories. He had paused, and Serafina could almost see him wrestling with how much truth about his son she could bear. "I blame myself. After she left, I gave him everything, trying to fill that hole. Private schools, cars, money, whenever he asked. I thought I was showing love, but I was just teaching him that there would always be someone to clean up his messes." They had sat in silence for a while, the crushing weight of his confession settling between them like another presence in the room. Finally, he had looked at her with eyes that held decades of disappointment. "I won't tell you to leave him," he'd said gently, "but I need you to know that I understand if you do, and if you stay, we protect each other." "Yes," Serafina had whispered, "from the worst of it." That had become their unspoken, sacred agreement. Charles would provide financial assistance when he could, and Serafina would shield him from the full, devastating extent of Christian's failures. They never explicitly discussed the money that passed between them, never acknowledged the elaborate fictions they diligently maintained. When Christian boasted to his father about a new client or a successful meeting, both Serafina and Charles would nod along, playing their parts. When Christian disappeared for hours on mysterious business, they would both pretend not to notice the suspicious charges at sports bars and nightclubs that invariably followed. But Serafina knew Charles saw everything. In his careful, methodical way, he was documenting his son's lies, observing the patterns, patiently waiting for a moment Serafina didn't yet comprehend. The quiet understanding that had blossomed between Charles and Serafina that Sunday morning became the bedrock of an unexpected friendship, forged in shared disappointment and mutual protection. They never again directly discussed Christian's lies, but the eloquent silence between them spoke volumes. Charles would discreetly slip money into her purse. Serafina would pretend not to notice the bills accumulating. And together, they meticulously maintained the elaborate fiction that Christian was perpetually one breakthrough away from monumental success. 18 months into this delicate dance, everything shifted with a single, jarring phone call. Serafina was engrossed in a client meeting downtown when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, she would have let it go to voicemail, but an inexplicable premonition compelled her to excuse herself and answer. "Is this Serafina Carter?" The voice belonged to an elderly woman, formal and laced with a tremor of nerves. "I'm Mrs. Chin, Charles's neighbor. I found him on the stairs this morning. He seemed dizzy, confused. The paramedics are taking him to Northwestern Memorial." The client meeting instantly dissolved into a blur of hasty apologies and grabbed belongings. Serafina called Christian 7 times on her frantic drive to the hospital, each call rerouting straight to voicemail. When she finally reached him, he was on a golf course in Schaumburg, the distinct sounds of laughter and clinking glasses audibly filtering through the phone. "Dad fell," she told him, her voice tight with fear. "He's at the hospital." His voice, though feigning appropriate concern, carried an unmistakable undertone of calculation, the mental accounting of how this development might affect his future. Charles was propped up in his hospital bed when Serafina arrived, looking more annoyed than frail at all the medical fuss. The doctor explained it was a mild case of vertigo, exacerbated by dehydration. Nothing life-threatening, but at his age, living alone presented significant risks. Charles waved off their concerns, insisting he was perfectly capable of caring for himself. But Serafina observed the subtle tremor in his hands, the way he instinctively gripped the bed rail when he believed no one was watching. Christian arrived 3 hours later, still in his golf attire, and delivered what might have been the performance of his lifetime. He clasped his father's hand, his eyes miraculously producing tears, and announced with elaborate ceremony that he was abandoning his current business venture to become Charles's full-time caregiver. "Dad, you've given me everything," he declared, loud enough for the nearby nurses to hear. "Now it's my turn. I'm moving back home. I'll take care of you. This is what family does." Charles looked over Christian's bowed head, and Serafina saw a complex blend of resignation and something else entirely. A flicker of hope, perhaps, that this crisis might finally be the catalyst that transformed his son. Serafina desperately wanted to share that hope, but Christian's speech sounded too polished, too perfect, as if he had meticulously rehearsed it during his drive over. For precisely 1 week, Christian embodied the role of the devoted son. He moved a small selection of clothes into Charles's apartment, diligently posted heartwarming photos on social media of him cooking breakfast for his father, ensuring that everyone in his digital orbit knew of the profound sacrifice he was making. On day 8, Serafina returned home early from work, plagued by a pounding migraine, only to witness something that instantly intensified her headache. A woman in navy blue scrubs was exiting their apartment building, checking her phone as she walked toward a sedan parked outside. She looked professional, competent, clearly the kind of private nurse whose services commanded several $100s a day. Serafina watched her drive away, then ascended to their apartment to find Christian sprawled on their couch, engrossed in an online poker game on his laptop. "How's your dad?" Serafina asked, her voice deliberately casual. Good. Just left him napping, made him lunch and everything." The lie flowed from him so effortlessly, so naturally, that had Serafina not seen the nurse herself, she would have believed him implicitly. That night, Serafina did something she was not proud of. While Christian slept soundly beside her, she went through his email, unearthing the incriminating correspondence with a home care agency. He had hired them the day after his grand, tearful announcement, meticulously billing Charles directly for round-the-clock care, all while meticulously maintaining the illusion that he, Christian, was providing everything himself. The most damning detail was an email in which Christian had explicitly instructed the agency to have their nurses wear regular clothes when entering and leaving the building to maintain discretion. The bills were staggering. $4,000 a week for care Christian claimed to be providing himself. Meanwhile, he spent perhaps an hour a day with Charles, usually during lunch, just long enough to snap a few photos to perpetuate his elaborate illusion. The remainder of his time was devoted to spending money with an unsettling urgency that genuinely frightened Serafina. Designer clothes began to materialize in their closet, tags carefully removed, but telltale receipts often hidden in jacket pockets. A Tag Heuer watch mysteriously appeared on his wrist, which he claimed was a gift from a grateful business contact. When Serafina dared to question him about a $3,000 charge on their credit card, he concocted an elaborate story about an investor who had paid him back in cash, which he had then immediately used to pay off the card before interest hit. "Besides," he'd said, examining his new watch with smug satisfaction, "Dad's not going to last forever. When the inheritance comes through, $3,000 will be nothing. We're just borrowing against our future." Our future. As if Serafina hadn't noticed he'd already started researching Miami condos. As if she hadn't seen the surreptitious messages to old college friends about being single again soon. As if she were too stupid, too naive to recognize that she was being systematically replaced by the hollow promise of money that didn't even exist yet. The next 2 months blurred into a haze of Christian's escalating brazen purchases and Charles's slow, agonizing decline. The vertigo had been an early, insidious warning sign of far graver issues. His heart was failing, slowly but relentlessly. The sharp, vibrant man who had once spent hours discussing intricate market strategies with Serafina could now barely remain awake through a brief visit. Christian would sit dutifully by his father's bedside, scrolling idly through his phone, occasionally glancing up to pat Charles's hand with performative affection whenever a nurse walked by. It was during one of these visits, on what would tragically be Charles's last lucid day, that everything became starkly, painfully clear. Christian had stepped out of the room to take a call, another fictional investor, another imaginary deal, leaving Charles and Serafina alone. His grip on her hand was surprisingly strong, urgent. "Serafina," he whispered, his voice rough but utterly clear, "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," she murmured, leaning closer, her heart aching. "The will reading. After I'm gone, you must be there. No matter what Christian says, no matter what excuse he gives, promise me." "I promise." "And Charles," she pressed, "Daniel Morrison, my lawyer, he has instructions. Everything is arranged." His eyes, clouded by medication and pain, suddenly sharpened with an unnerving lucidity. "I know about the nurse. I've always known. Just like I know about the credit cards, the lies, all of it." Serafina's face must have betrayed her shock because he squeezed her hand gently. "A father knows his son," he said, his voice imbued with sorrowful wisdom. "But sometimes wisdom matters more than blood. Remember that. Wisdom matters more than wealth, more than anything." He fumbled at his bedside table, pulling out a small, worn leather journal, its cover soft with age. Inside the front cover, in shaky, almost illegible handwriting, he had inscribed, "For Serafina's thoughts, and for truth when the time comes." "Keep this," he instructed, his voice fading. "Write down everything, the truth, not the story Christian tells. Someone should remember what really happened." Christian returned then, sliding his phone into his pocket with the satisfied look of someone how. who had just successfully spun another lie. He glanced briefly at his father, then at his expensive watch, the one that couldn't buy him a conscience. "Dad looks tired," he announced, his voice lacking genuine concern. "We should go. The nurse will be here soon." He quickly corrected himself, adding, I'll come back this evening to check on him." Charles closed his eyes, his grip on Serafina's hand unwavering. "Remember your promise," he whispered, so softly that Christian didn't hear. 3 days later, Charles died peacefully in his sleep, finally free from both his failing heart and his perpetually failing son. Christian, true to form, was at a bar when it happened, celebrating a deal that didn't exist with money he didn't yet possess. Serafina was the one who received the somber call, the one who sat vigil with Charles's body until the funeral home arrived, the one who truly mourned. The funeral director's assistant kindly helped Serafina gather Charles's personal effects from the hospital room, while Christian impatiently waited in the car, the engine already running. Charles's reading glasses sat folded on the nightstand, beside the leather journal he had entrusted to Serafina just days earlier. The nurse who had been on duty when Charles passed touched Serafina's shoulder gently, whispering that he had gone peacefully at 5:47 a.m. No pain, just a quiet slipping away, like someone finally granted permission to rest. Christian had received the call at 6 a.m., and by 6:15 a.m. he was already texting someone about meeting for drinks to celebrate a business opportunity. The drive home from Northwestern Memorial stretched agonizingly through morning traffic, affording Serafina too much time to observe Christian's disturbing transformation. His eyes were still red when they exited the parking garage, but by the time they reached Lakeshore Drive, he was already dictating fervent voice memos about liquidating assets and researching tax implications of large inheritances. At a red light near Oak Street, Serafina caught him typing Miami beachfront condos over $5 million into his phone browser. Charles's body was still warm, and his son was already spending money that existed only in his feverish imagination. "We need to call Brennan's funeral home," Serafina said, breaking the oppressive silence. "Your father mentioned once that he wanted whatever's fastest," Christian interrupted, merging aggressively into the left lane. "Simple service, quick burial. Dad wouldn't want to fuss." Charles had actually told Serafina he wanted his book club friends to read passages from his favorite novels at the service, that he wanted jazz music because it reminded him of his youth, that he hoped people would share stories over good wine and remember him laughing. None of that mattered to Christian, who perceived his father's death as an inconvenient delay before his inevitable payday. By the time they reached their apartment, Christian had already contacted 3 real estate agents in Miami, scheduled a call with an estate attorney he had haphazardly found online, and researched Lamborghini dealerships. Serafina sat at their kitchen table, calling Charles's friends from the numbers in his old address book, while Christian paced behind her, engaging in loud, performative conversations about investment opportunities and portfolio diversification with people who had no idea he possessed no money to invest. The funeral took place 2 days later at a chapel in Skokie that Christian had chosen purely because they offered a package deal. A relentless February rain transformed the cemetery into a treacherous mud field that clung to their shoes as they made their way to the graveside. Christian had insisted on delivering the eulogy, pulling up a generic template on his phone in the car and literally reading from the screen at the podium. "Charles was a loving father who taught me everything I know about business," he proclaimed, a statement that was technically true, as Charles had taught him nothing, and he knew nothing. He lived a full life and leaves behind a legacy of success. Generic, hollow words that could have been applied to anyone's father, delivered with all the emotion of a weather report. During the burial ceremony, as the rabbi spoke solemnly about dust and return and eternal rest, Christian stood beside Serafina, checking his phone every 30 seconds. She watched him typing with one hand, the other holding a black umbrella angled not to shield his father's casket from the rain, but to protect his phone screen. The estate lawyer had apparently messaged him about probate timelines, and that clearly was of greater importance than witnessing Charles being lowered into the earth. The reception afterward served as a stark revelation, laying bare everything Serafina had been too blind, too hopeful to see. Charles's book club friends, gentle, wise people in their 70s and 80s who had known him for decades, formed a protective circle around Serafina, actively, almost pointedly, avoiding Christian. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had led their discussions of Hemingway and Morrison, pulled Serafina aside near the coffee station. "Charles worried about you," she said quietly, her hand warm and comforting on Serafina's. "He made us promise to check on you after everything settles." "After what settles?" Serafina had asked, but Mrs. Rodriguez simply squeezed her hand and moved away as Christian approached, his false smile preceding him like a cautionary flag. "Great turnout," he declared, even though fewer than 20 people had come. Dad would have been proud. He checked his watch, a flash of undisguised impatience crossing his face. "How much longer do we need to stay?" They left an hour later, Christian complaining vociferously about the waste of time, while Serafina sat in silent contemplation in the passenger seat, clutching a cardboard box of Charles's books that Mrs. Rodriguez had insisted she take. "He would want you to have these," she had said, and something in her tone suggested a deeper knowledge than she was articulating. That night, Christian opened a bottle of champagne he had been saving for a special occasion. To new beginnings, he toasted himself, as Serafina had declined a glass. He consumed most of the bottle, scrolling through yacht listings on his laptop, occasionally reading prices aloud as if selecting items from a restaurant menu. Serafina retired early, utterly exhausted from grief and the emotional labor of pretending Christian's behavior wasn't utterly appalling. But sleep refused to come. She lay there, listening to him on the phone in the living room, his voice growing louder as the champagne took hold, making grandiose promises about investments and partnerships that would magically materialize once his funds cleared. The morning after the burial, Serafina woke to find Christian already awake, impeccably dressed in his best suit, papers meticulously spread across their kitchen table. Her black funeral dress still hung dismally on the bathroom door, where she had left it the night before. She hadn't even had her first sip of coffee when he launched into his presentation. $210 million, he announced, standing as if addressing a high-stakes board meeting. "That's what Dad's estate is worth. I've already talked to Daniel Morrison, Dad's lawyer. The probate should clear within days." He then slid the divorce papers across the table with the casual efficiency of someone concluding a successful business deal. "I finally don't need your pathetic salary anymore. You've been useful for paying rent, but now you're worthless to me." The words delivered with such callous disdain should have shattered her. They should have sent her spiraling into tears, begging for reconsideration. Instead, she felt something entirely different. A cold, crystalline clarity like ice water coursing through her veins. Charles's voice echoed in her memory. "Wisdom matters more than wealth." The leather journal he had given her lay nestled in her purse, way up, and tucked inside it was Daniel Morrison's business card, with that urgent voicemail she still hadn't returned. "Fine," Serafina heard herself say, her voice steady and calm as she reached for Christian's offered pen. "But I want this done properly, through lawyers." "Whatever makes you feel better," Christian chuckled, already mentally redecorating his Miami penthouse. "Daniel will handle everything, estate, divorce, all of it. Clean break." Serafina signed her name with deliberate care, each letter a quiet, resolute goodbye to the life she had tried to construct with a man incapable of building anything of substance. Christian snatched the papers back, his grin so wide it looked painful. "You can keep this dump," he said, gesturing around their apartment with dismissive disdain. "Consider it severance." 20 minutes later, Serafina stood in their bedroom, packing a single small suitcase, choosing only essentials. Christian's triumphant phone calls resonated from the living room, directed at friends, acquaintances, anyone who would listen to his extravagant plans. "I'm thinking of starting a hedge fund," she heard him boast. "With $200 million in capital, I could really make waves." The elevator in their building seemed to take an eternity to arrive, granting her too much time to think. But she wasn't thinking about Christian, or the divorce, or even the money. Her thoughts were consumed by Charles's grip on her hand, surprisingly strong for a dying man, and his insistent plea that she attend the will reading. She recalled Mrs. Rodriguez's meaningful looks and carefully chosen words, and Daniel Morrison's urgent voicemail, the one Christian didn't know existed. The taxi driver who picked her up outside studied Serafina in his rearview mirror as she sat clutching her suitcase like a fragile life preserver. "You okay, miss?" he asked gently. "Rough morning?" "I'm about to find out," Serafina replied, pulling out her phone to finally return Daniel Morrison's call. The phone rang twice before Daniel answered, his voice professional, but carrying an indefinable undertone. "Mrs. Carter, I've been expecting your call. Are you somewhere private where we can speak?" The taxi had just pulled up to a Hampton Inn near the airport, far enough from their Lincoln Park apartment that Christian wouldn't accidentally stumble upon her. Serafina asked the driver to wait while she finished the call, watching planes ascend into the gray February morning sky, each one carrying people toward new lives, while hers hung suspended between what was and what might be. "Mr. Morrison, your voicemail mentioned something about the will?" Reading, Christian said everything was already settled. There was a pause, followed by the faint rustle of papers. "Mrs. Carter, your husband has made several assumptions about his father's estate. Charles was very specific in his instructions. Both you and Christian must attend the formal reading. Are you available tomorrow at 10 a.m.? Christian mentioned the estate is worth $210 million, Serafina stated, needing to grasp the full scope of the elaborate game being played. "The gross value of the estate is indeed substantial," Daniel replied carefully, each word measured like ingredients in a delicate recipe. "However, Charles was very particular about the distribution terms. I cannot say more until the formal reading, but I strongly advise you to attend." Charles insisted on it. After confirming her attendance, Serafina paid the taxi driver and checked into the hotel using the credit card manned. Christian didn't know about, the one she had discreetly kept for emergencies since her first marriage. The room was standard business traveler blandness. Beige walls, dark curtains, a bed identical to thousands across the country. It felt appropriate somehow, this neutral, liminal space between her old life and whatever lay ahead. For the first time in 3 years, she called in sick to work. Her supervisor, Janet, sounded genuinely concerned. "Serafina, you haven't missed a day since you started. Is everything all right?" "Family emergency," Serafina said, which was true enough. "I need a few days to sort things out." She ordered room service that afternoon, a club sandwich that might as well have been cardboard for all she tasted it. The television played cable news on mute while she scrolled through apartment listings on her laptop, attempting to envision a new beginning at 38 with whatever remained after Christian's financial devastation. Studio apartments in Rogers Park, one-bedrooms in Uptown, places where radiators clanged and walls were thin, but the rent was manageable on a single income. That evening, while unpacking her hastily filled suitcase, she found Charles's leather journal at the bottom, wrapped in one of her sweaters. Inside the front cover, beneath his inscription about it being "For my thoughts," was an envelope she hadn't noticed before. Her name was written across it in Charles's shaky handwriting, dated exactly 1 month before his death. The letter inside spanned 3 pages, written in bursts as his strength allowed, the handwriting growing weaker towards the end. "My dear Serafina," it began. "If you're reading this, then things have unfolded as I feared they would. First, I owe you an apology. I knew who Christian was when you married him. I had hoped, prayed, that your influence might change him. Instead, he simply used your kindness as another resource to exploit." Serafina had to set the letter down, her hands trembling. Outside, planes continued their departures, their lights blinking through the gathering dusk. After a moment, she continued reading. "Christian has always been this way. His mother, God rest her soul, left when she couldn't bear the lying anymore. I blamed myself, tried to compensate with money, with things, with endless second chances. Each time I made him worse. You asked once why I lived so modestly despite my wealth. The truth is, I've been protecting that wealth from my son for years, knowing he would destroy himself with it." The next paragraph made her breath catch in her throat. "I've made provisions in my will that Christian knows nothing about. He's never read it, despite my attempts to discuss it with him. He assumes, as he always does, that everything will simply flow to him. Daniel Morrison has my complete instructions. Trust him. Attend the reading. No matter what Christian says or does, justice has a way of arriving in unexpected packages. The letter concluded with words that brought forth tears she thought she had exhausted. You deserved better than the hand you were dealt. Christian's marriage to you was the only good decision he ever made, though he'll never understand why. Be strong, my dear. What's coming will be difficult, but necessary. And please don't blame yourself for any of this. Some people cannot be saved, only survived. Serafina folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the journal. Her phone, which she had set to silent, showed 17 missed calls from Christian and dozens of text messages. The progression was almost comedic in its predictability. First demands, "Where are you? This is ridiculous." Then anger, "You don't get to just disappear. We have things to discuss." Followed by false concern, "I'm worried about you. Just let me know you're safe." Then manipulation, "We can work this out. Maybe I was too hasty." Back to anger, "You're being childish. Grow up." Threats, "I'll take everything in the divorce. You'll get nothing." And finally, gloating, "Estate clears probate tomorrow. Thanks for making this easy by leaving. By the way, keeping the apartment was generous of me. You should be grateful." Serafina didn't respond to any of them. Let him believe he had won, that she had simply fled in defeat. The truth would arrive soon enough, wrapped in meticulous legal language and witnessed by Daniel Morrison's unimpeachable professional presence. That night, she lay in the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, city lights filtering through the curtains, creating shifting patterns with each passing car. Somewhere across Chicago, Christian was probably out celebrating his imaginary fortune, running up tabs he couldn't pay, making promises he couldn't keep. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but all she felt was a profound weariness, bone deep, soul deep, from years of propping up someone who utterly confused taking with earning. On the second day, Serafina forced herself to eat breakfast in the hotel lobby, surrounded by business travelers checking emails and families heading to the airport. Normal people living normal lives, utterly unaware that at the next table sat a woman whose entire existence had exploded and reformed in the dizzying span of 72 hours. She spent the afternoon in the hotel's business center, meticulously updating her resume and researching market salaries for financial analysts. If nothing else came from Charles's mysterious provisions, at least she could rebuild her career, free from Christian's insidious financial drain on every paycheck. The third morning arrived, gray and bitterly cold, perfect weather for profound revelations. Daniel Morrison called at 8 a.m. to confirm the meeting. "Both parties have confirmed attendance," he said formally. "I want to prepare you that this may be emotionally challenging." Charles anticipated various reactions. "Will Christian be getting his $210 million? Serafina asked directly, her voice betraying none of her internal turmoil. Daniel's pause was eloquent, almost deliberately dramatic. Mr. Carter will be receiving exactly what his father intended him to receive, based on the conditions Charles established. Nothing more, nothing less. Serafina chose her clothes with deliberate care. Professional black slacks and a crisp gray blazer, the uniform of someone with nothing left to prove and nothing to hide. The woman reflected in the hotel mirror looked older than 38, but stronger somehow, as if immense pressure had compressed her into something harder and infinitely more valuable. The elevator in Daniel Morrison's building ascended 23 floors, carrying Serafina upward while she studied her reflection in its polished doors. The professional woman staring back looked composed, resolute, but underneath her pulse hammered with a mixture of anticipation and fierce determination. She stepped out into a reception area that whispered of old money and established power. Dark wood paneling, plush leather chairs that had undoubtedly cradled decades of secrets. Oil paintings of Chicago's skyline before the glass towers had fully dominated. Christian was already there, sprawled carelessly in one of those leather chairs as if he already owned the place. The new suit he wore still bore the subtle sheen of fresh fabric, likely purchased yesterday with a credit card he couldn't possibly pay. A Rolex. A fake, Serafina could tell by the telltale tick rather than sweep of the second hand, adorned his wrist. He didn't bother to look up from his phone when she entered, his fingers flying across the screen as he typed what were undoubtedly more grand promises about investments he'd soon make. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," the receptionist announced, her voice crisp and formal. "Mr. Morrison will see you now." Only then did Christian acknowledge Serafina's presence, his eyes sliding over her with a dismissive, calculating glance. She wore the same charcoal blazer she'd worn to a dozen client meetings, the same practical slacks, the same modest watch Charles had given her for Christmas 2 years ago. Next to Christian's desperate, ostentatious display of imagined wealth, Serafina looked exactly like what she was, a woman who worked for a living. Daniel Morrison's office commanded a corner of the building, its windows on 2 sides offering a panoramic view of the Chicago River winding through the city like a gray, shimmering ribbon. The man himself stood as they entered, silver-haired and dignified, in a way that made Christian's flashy suit look even more like a cheap costume. His desk, a massive mahogany piece that could easily have doubled as a dining table, dominated the room. "Please sit," Daniel said, gesturing to 2 chairs positioned side by side, directly facing his imposing desk. Christian immediately attempted to angle his chair away from Serafina's, as if mere proximity to her might somehow contaminate his impending fortune. Daniel observed this small, childish performance with an unreadable expression, then settled into his own chair with the measured movements of someone who possessed all the time in the world. "Before we begin," Daniel said, pulling a thick, official-looking folder from his desk drawer, "I need to confirm some details. Christian, you filed for divorce from Serafina 3 days ago, correct?" Christian waved his hand impatiently. Yes, it's all filed. Can we get to the estate distribution? I have appointments this afternoon." Serafina knew he didn't, but the lie flowed from him as naturally as breathing. "And you've both signed the papers?" Daniel continued, his tone perfectly neutral. "Signed and submitted," Christian confirmed, leaning forward eagerly, his eyes gleaming with avarice. "Now, about the $210 million, did you read your father's will, Christian?" Daniel interrupted, the question dropping into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of discomfort. Christian's eagerness visibly stuttered. Dad told me years ago. I'm the sole beneficiary," he stammered, his confidence suddenly faltering. "I asked if you've read the actual will," Daniel repeated, sliding the thick folder across the gleaming mahogany surface with deliberate, almost theatrical precision. "The document itself, not what you remember from conversations." Serafina watched Christian's face shift from annoyance to a nascent uncertainty. His hand hesitated before he finally took the folder, and she saw Daniel's mouth twitch in what might have been the ghost of a triumphant smile. Christian opened the folder with a residual air of confidence, fully expecting to confirm what he already knew. Serafina watched his eyes scan the first page. The standard legal boilerplate establishing Charles's identity, his soundness of mind, the date of the will's last revision, just 1 month before his death. Christian's forehead creased slightly, perhaps a flicker of wonder why his father had updated his will so recently, but he pressed on, assured of his imminent victory. The second page was where everything irrevocably changed. Serafina could visually track his reading by the profound way his face transformed. First, confusion as he encountered language about contingencies and conditions. Then disbelief as he reached the marriage clause, the explicit requirement that he remain married to Serafina for 1 full year after Charles's death to inherit the full estate. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably as he found the next section, the one detailing the charitable trust for financial literacy that would receive the bulk of the estate if the marriage condition was not met. "This can't be right," Christian whispered, his voice barely audible, laced with a dawning horror. "There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake," Daniel said calmly, his voice unwavering. "Your father was quite specific. The full inheritance of $210 million was contingent upon your maintaining your marriage to Serafina. He believed," Daniel paused, consulting the document, and I'm quoting directly, "that Christian needs Serafina's wisdom and stability to handle such wealth responsibly." Christian's face had gone utterly pale, making his fake tan appear a garish orange in the morning light streaming through the windows. "But I filed for divorce," We can stop it. We can withdraw the papers." He whirled to face Serafina, his eyes wild with raw panic. "Serafina, we can fix this. Tell him we've reconciled." Daniel continued, utterly unfazed by Christian's outburst. "According to the terms, in the event of divorce proceedings initiated by you within 1 year of Charles's death, the entire estate transfers to the Harbor Light Foundation for Financial Literacy, minus a small personal stipend." "How small?" Christian's voice cracked, a strangled gasp. $50,000, Daniel replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your father felt this was, and I quote, sufficient for Christian to start over and hopefully learn the value of work and loyalty." The silence that followed was absolute, complete. Even the distant city noise from 23 floors below seemed to pause, holding its breath. Christian stared at the will as if the words might magically rearrange themselves if he looked hard enough. His new suit, meant to project success, suddenly seemed to hang wrong on his shoulders, like a child playing dress-up in his father's oversized clothes. Then came the frantic bargaining. "Serafina, please," Christian pleaded, turning to her fully for the first time since she had entered the office, his eyes desperate. "We can work this out. I was hasty, emotional from grief. We don't have to go through with the divorce." Serafina met his gaze steadily, unblinking. "You told me I was worthless to you." "I didn't mean it. I was upset about Dad. You know how grief affects people." "You were Googling Miami condos before his body was cold," Serafina countered, her voice calm, devoid of any emotional flicker. Christian's tactics shifted rapidly, cycling through every manipulation he had ever employed. First came promises. "We can split it, $100 million each, more money than either of us could spend." Then rationalization. "Dad would want us to work this out. He loved us both." Followed by threats. "I'll contest the will. This is undue influence." "You poisoned him against me." And finally, tears. Actual wet tears that might have moved Serafina if she hadn't, years ago, watched him meticulously practice crying in their bathroom mirror before crucial investor meetings. "Christian," Serafina said, her voice a quiet anchor in the storm, the serene tone that comes when anger has passed, replaced by an icy, crystal-clear understanding. "You spent 4 years living off my salary while pretending to be an entrepreneur. You lied to your dying father about caring for him while hiring a nurse with his own money. You counted the days until his death like an advent calendar filled with $100 bills. And the very moment you thought you didn't need me, you threw me away." She stood, smoothing her practical slacks, and looked down at the man she had once foolishly believed she could save with enough patience and unwavering support. "Your father knew exactly who you are. That's why he put these conditions in place. He wanted to teach you one final, crucial lesson about the enduring value of loyalty and honest work." She turned to Daniel Morrison. "Please proceed with the divorce as filed. I believe Charles would be pleased to know his fortune will now help thousands of people acquire financial literacy, something his son never bothered to learn." Christian's face cycled through an agonizing spectrum of disbelief, incandescent rage, and finally, a profound, broken desperation that might have been the first genuine emotion Serafina had seen from him in years. This broken desperation, however, lingered for only a fleeting moment before it transmuted into something far uglier. He shot to his feet, the expensive leather chair spinning wildly behind him, and pointed an accusatory, trembling finger at Serafina. "You planned this. You and Dad conspired against me. You turned him against his own son." His voice rose with each word, echoing shrilly off the law office's rich, wood-paneled walls. Daniel Morrison remained imperturbably seated, calm as a placid lake, while Christian raged like a furious storm above it. Serafina stayed in her chair, observing the man she had married as he inadvertently stripped away every layer of entitlement and delusion he had so carefully concealed behind a veneer of charm and false promises. "Mr. Carter," Daniel said evenly, his voice a steady counterpoint to Christian's fury, "I can assure you that your father's will was drafted entirely at his discretion. Mrs. Carter had no knowledge of its contents until this very moment." "That's impossible." Christian slammed his hand onto the massive mahogany desk, making a crystal paperweight jump with a resonant thud. She must have manipulated him. He was sick, vulnerable. This is undue influence, elder abuse, Something. Daniel calmly opened another folder, pulling out several documents bearing official seals. Your father updated his will multiple times over the past 5 years, each version adding more specific conditions regarding your inheritance. He met with me monthly while in perfect mental health. We have medical evaluations, witness statements, and video recordings of each session where he explicitly stated his reasoning. Christian's rage flickered, swallowed by a dawning, terrifying uncertainty. Your father insisted on documenting everything. He anticipated you might contest the will, Daniel explained, pulling out a sleek tablet and swiping to a file dated 6 weeks before Charles's death. Would you like to see your father explaining in his own words why he structured his estate this way? Christian sank back into his chair as if Daniel had pulled a gun rather than a tablet. No, I don't. That's not necessary. But Daniel continued, relentless in his professional courtesy. There's more you should understand about the distribution. The $50,000 designated for you isn't freely accessible. Your father placed it in a trust with specific conditions. What conditions? Christian's voice had shrunk to barely a whisper. You must provide proof of employment to access the funds. Full-time employment maintained for at least 6 months. The trust will release $10,000 upon proof of hire, then the remaining $40,000 after 6 months of verified employment. Christian emitted a hollow laugh, which sounded more like choking. He's trying to control me even from the grave. He's trying to teach you what he couldn't while alive, Serafina said quietly, speaking for the first time since standing to leave. Christian turned on her again, but this time his anger had curdled into something desperate and mean-spirited. You think you've won something here? You get nothing either. You heard him. The money goes to charity, not you. Daniel cleared his throat delicately. Actually, that's not entirely accurate, Mr. Carter. There's a separate provision for Mrs. Carter. He pulled out yet another document. Charles left her a personal bequest of $25,000 along with this note. He handed Serafina an envelope with her name in Charles's familiar handwriting. Inside, a brief, heartfelt message. For the fresh start you deserve, and for the kindness you showed an old man who didn't deserve it. Use this to build the life Christian never could give you. $25,000. Not life-changing money, but enough to secure a new apartment, pay off the credit cards Christian had recklessly maxed out, maybe even take a small vacation somewhere warm, a place where she could finally remember what it felt like to truly relax. This is insane, Christian muttered, running his hands through his carefully styled hair until it stood in disarray. $210 million, and it's all going to strangers because I filed for divorce 3 days too early. Not strangers, Daniel corrected gently. The Harbor Light Foundation for Financial Literacy. Your father served on several nonprofit boards and hand-selected the trustees for this foundation. They include educators, social workers, and financial counselors who will use the funds to teach practical money management to underserved communities. Your father called it his true legacy. Christian's face contorted as the full, crushing weight of his situation finally crashed down upon him. I have nothing. No job, but no savings, no apartment. I spent everything I had because I thought. He trailed off, utterly unable to admit he had been brazenly counting his father's money before the man was even buried. You have $50,000 waiting once you maintain employment, Daniel reminded him, his voice still composed. That's more than many people start with. I'm 41 years old. Christian's voice cracked again, rising toward a fragile hysteria. I haven't had a real job in 3 years. Who's gonna hire me? For what? His shouting had reached a pitch that made Daniel subtly press a button discreetly located under his desk. Within seconds, a security guard appeared in the doorway, his presence quiet but utterly unmistakable. Mr. Carter, Daniel said, standing now, his demeanor professional and firm. I think we've covered everything necessary today. The documents will be filed with the court this afternoon. If you need assistance understanding the trust terms, my assistant can provide you with a referral to an employment counselor. Christian looked between Daniel, the silent security guard, and Serafina, his face cycling through emotions like a slot machine spinning towards inevitable loss. Finally, he deflated entirely, slumping in the expensive leather chair as if all his bones had suddenly dissolved. "How am I supposed to survive?" he asked the room, the question so small it barely traveled across the expansive desk. "The same way everyone else does," Serafina said, gathering her purse and the envelope containing Charles's thoughtful note. "By working." The security guard stepped aside as Serafina moved toward the door. Behind her, she heard Christian's voice one more time, not shouting now, but worse. Broken in a way that might have moved her if she hadn't spent 4 years being systematically broken by his relentless selfishness. "Serafina, please. We could have had everything." She paused at the threshold but didn't turn around. "No, Christian," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You could have had everything. All you had to do was value what you already had." The elevator ride down felt not like descending, but like ascending. Each floor carried her further from the suffocating weight of Christian's collapse, higher towards her own burgeoning freedom. In the opulent lobby, she stopped at a carved wooden bench to reread Charles's note, letting his poignant words sink in properly. A fresh start. Not a fortune, but enough to build something real, something entirely hers. 1 week later, Daniel Morrison called to confirm what Serafina already knew in her heart. The divorce had been finalized without contest. Christian hadn't even hired a lawyer, likely because he couldn't afford one. The estate had been distributed exactly as Charles intended. The Harbor Light Foundation had received its initial funding and was already in the process of setting up vital programs across Chicago's South Side, precisely where Charles had built his shopping centers decades ago. "There's one more thing," Daniel said, his professional tone warming slightly. "Charles left instructions for me to tell you this only after everything was settled. He wanted you to know that of all the investments he made in his lifetime, introducing you to his son was the one that hurt him most. But seeing who you were, despite Christian's influence, was what gave him hope in the end." Daniel's words about Charles's final message stayed with Serafina as she hung up the phone. The late afternoon sun streamed through her hotel window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny, joyous celebrations in the air. She had $25,000, a finalized divorce, and for the first time in 4 years, no one else's failures to manage. The freedom felt strange, exhilarating, like wearing comfortable shoes after years of walking barefoot on broken glass. 2 weeks after that pivotal phone call, Serafina signed the lease on a studio apartment in the Loop. The building was older, with radiators that clanged rhythmically in winter and windows that often stuck stubbornly in summer. But the view stretched magnificently across Grant Park to Lake Michigan. The space was barely 600 square feet, smaller than just the living room in the apartment she had shared with Christian, yet every single inch of it belonged unequivocally to her. The first night there, she sat on the floor eating Chinese takeout amidst a landscape of unpacked boxes and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. A profound, quiet contentment. No one would criticize her choice of curtains or label her furniture purchases as wasteful. No one would drain her bank account for fictional business ventures. The walls were hers to paint, the silence hers to fill or to simply preserve. She hung Charles's photograph on the bookshelf she'd bought from a secondhand store on Milwaukee Avenue. It was from one of their Sunday conversations, capturing him mid-laugh at something she had said about market predictions. His eyes crinkled with genuine warmth, the kind of authentic expression Christian had never inherited or learned to fake. Below the photo, she placed the leather journal he had given her, now thoughtfully filled with her own reflections about starting over. The foundation had sent her volunteer orientation materials, and she spread them across her small dining table, studying the curriculum they used for financial literacy. Classes, basic budgeting, understanding credit, the crucial difference between wants and needs. Concepts so fundamentally simple, yet so utterly foreign to Christian's way of thinking. She thought about Charles designing this entire program, knowing his son would never truly benefit from it, but hoping that countless others would. Her first volunteer session was scheduled for a Saturday morning at a community center on the South Side, one of the very buildings Charles had helped develop decades ago in the 1990s. The irony was not lost on her. She would be teaching financial wisdom in a place Charles built, using money Charles had meticulously left to prevent people from becoming precisely what Christian had become. Meanwhile, Christian's new harsh reality unfolded through fragmented updates that reached Serafina through mutual acquaintances. Tom from her office mentioned seeing him at a job fair at Navy Pier, wearing the same designer suit that now looked noticeably worn at the edges, handing out resumes to companies that hired entry-level sales representatives. The image was almost picaresque. The man who had spent years pretending to be a CEO now reduced to begging for a chance to make cold calls. Rachel, who worked at the bank where they'd once held their joint account, told Serafina he had tried to open a business line of credit using his father's estate as collateral. When she had patiently explained that he had no claim to the estate, he had apparently stood at her desk for 10 minutes, utterly unable to comprehend that his inheritance had simply evaporated. She'd had to call security when he stubbornly refused to leave, insisting there must be some mistake. The most telling update arrived from Mrs. Chin, Charles's former neighbor, who called Serafina one evening 3 months after the will reading. Christian had moved into Charles's old apartment not out of any sentimental attachment, but because it was rent-controlled, and the kind landlord who had known Charles for 30 years had graciously agreed to let him stay for 6 months at a reduced rent, out of respect for his father's memory. "He looks terrible," Mrs. Chin said, her voice a mixture of pity and disapproval. "Thin, unshaven. I saw him carrying grocery bags from the dollar store yesterday." The same boy who used to boast endlessly about his grand business ventures now couldn't even afford proper groceries. Serafina felt no satisfaction hearing this, only a hollow acknowledgement that consequences had finally, irrevocably found someone who had spent his entire life skillfully avoiding them. Christian was, at long last, learning what Serafina had known all along, that genuine survival required actual, honest work, not merely the performance of it. Eventually, word reached her that he had found employment at a call center in Schaumburg, the kind that sold extended warranties for obscure appliances. The same man who had once spent $40,000 of Serafina's money on elaborate networking lunches now spent his days diligently reading from scripts, desperately trying to convince strangers to buy something they didn't truly need. His first paycheck would unlock a portion of his trust fund, but $10,000, Serafina knew, would not go far for someone who had never, ever learned to budget. Serafina's Saturdays at the foundation quickly became the highlight of her week. The community center buzzed with people hungry to learn, single mothers meticulously stretching minimum wage across impossible math, elderly folks attempting to demystify reverse mortgages, young couples diligently saving for their first home. They arrived with worn notebooks and earnest questions, with hope radiating despite their struggles, reminding Serafina that financial stress didn't necessarily have to equate to financial ignorance. During one session, a woman named Maria timidly asked about dealing with family members who constantly borrowed money. "My brother always has an emergency," she said, her voice laced with weary resignation. "Always a big opportunity that needs just a little investment." The other participants nodded knowingly, and Serafina thought of Christian, of all the emergencies and opportunities that had so systematically drained her accounts. "Sometimes," Serafina said, choosing her words with careful precision, "the kindest thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their choices. Support doesn't always mean enabling." After class, Serafina often stayed behind to help individual participants with specific questions. One afternoon, while helping a young man grasp the concept of compound interest, she noticed a new portrait hanging in the center's main hall. Charles's face looked out from an ornate frame, a brass plaque beneath it proudly reading, "Charles Morrison, Builder of Communities, Teacher of Wisdom." The center director, James, noticed Serafina gazing at it. "Did you know him?" he asked, his voice gentle. "He was my father-in-law," Serafina said, then corrected herself softly. "Former father-in-law." James studied her for a moment, recognition slowly dawning in his eyes. "You're Serafina," he said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "He mentioned you in his foundation documents, said you understood the value of both money and character." 6 months after the will reading, Serafina received a